Konnichiwa. I want to start out by offering some thanks. First of all, thanks to the Asahi Glass Foundation for this great award that inspires people, inspires me, and will inspire many others after us. And I am so honored to receive this Blue Planet Prize. I also want to thank my university, the Institute of Transportation Studies at University of California, Davis. I founded it in 1991, but it has grown to be a great, very important institute in California, in the United States, and the world. But really, the award that I received was due to my many colleagues and my many students that work with me, that provide me with all of the insight and the brilliant research that I can use as I go forward and as I think about and address some of the major problems facing our planet. And I would note that it is just recently was designated the National Center for Sustainable Transportation in the United States. Those are all my colleagues and my students. I also want to thank the California Air Resources Board. So my main job, I call it my day job, is at the university. But then I have another job, I call it my moonlighting job at night, not really at night, but in my extra hours, is working with the California Air Resources Board as a board member. And this agency is very impressive. It is the leader in the world in developing air pollution policies and regulations that have been imitated everywhere. They are important not just in California, but around the world. And I have played a role, and I've been very proud to be part of the development and implementation of zero-emission vehicle mandate, low-carbon fuel standards, and many other policies that are now being adopted around the world. And I say this because the Air Resources Board has taught me how to bring science to policy, how scientists can influence policy, but it's also how policymakers need to learn how to work with experts and scientists and to create a partnership together. And I will talk more about that later. So let me get to the substance of my talk. The population of the world is increasing. We have about 7 billion people, and it is expected to increase by 3 billion to about 10 billion during this century. So we are going to have many more people, and those people are getting more rich, wealthier, and with more people and more affluence, the result is many more vehicles. So if we think that there is a problem today in the world in terms of all of the cars and trucks that we have, it's only going to get much worse in the future. So this is a graph from my most recent book, 2 Billion Cars. So many people would say all of these vehicles means that there's going to be much more energy use. And that is probably correct. That is definitely correct if we continue on the same path. But they worry that we are going to run out of oil. So my first conclusion, my first insight that I want to share with you is that the problem is not lack of oil. There is tremendous amounts, huge amounts of oil, petroleum in the world, fossil energy that can be converted into gasoline and diesel, almost unlimited amounts of it. So this is a graph from a few years ago from the International Energy Agency, but it's still correct today. And that is that, as you look at the graph, you can see we have, in the world through all of human history, we have consumed about 1 trillion barrels of oil. There's another trillion barrels in the Middle East, and then there's more oil found in other countries around the world. But then after that, there's still much more fossil energy that can be used for fuel. In the Arctic, by the way, one of the impacts of climate change will be to melt much of the Arctic Ocean and make it possible to extract even more fossil energy that is under the Arctic Ocean. So we have a lot of oil left in the Arctic. We have a lot of oil that is offshore in deep water. We have a lot of oil in oil sands in Canada, heavy oil in Venezuela, shale oil in many, many places around the world. Huge amounts of this. And it can probably be converted into gasoline and diesel fuel at costs of less than $100 per barrel. In other words, even at today's oil prices, there are virtually unlimited amounts of oil available. So that might be a good story, but it's not. And that is because all of that extra oil I'm talking about, the oil sands, the heavy oil, it requires a lot of energy to get it out of the ground or from below the ocean, and it requires a lot of energy to process it into gasoline and diesel and jet fuel. And so all of that additional energy means there's a lot more carbon. So every gallon, in the future, every gallon of gasoline will actually result in the emissions of much more carbon than a gallon of gasoline today. And this is important because, indeed, we do have an energy revolution, a fossil energy revolution happening in the world today. There are tremendous amounts of this additional unconventional oil, this oil shale, these shale oils, these heavy oils, and so on. And it's being found everywhere, all over the world, in many, many different places. Huge amounts of it in Argentina and China, in Europe, in the United States, and it is starting to be developed at relatively low cost. But here is an image of what that all means. So this is oil sands, or sometimes called tar sands in Canada. This is a typical mine, tar sands mine. It's about 10 kilometers long. So not only does this oil result in more carbon emissions, but it requires large amounts of water. It devastates large amounts of land. It affects the habitats, the species. So the environmental impacts are very large, even in addition to the carbon impacts. So you just heard a lecture about climate science. So I'm not going to talk to you more about climate science, except that I agree with what Dr. Matsuno says and his colleagues, that climate change is a huge problem, a huge challenge. It's probably the greatest threat to human civilization, the greatest threat facing the human race. And we haven't just discovered this. This is a Time magazine, a magazine from 7 years ago, where it was already saying how important this problem was, that we had to deal with it. So here we are, 7 years later, still making very little progress. And that is one of my biggest concerns, and that is what my discussion today is about, is how do we move forward in reducing carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions? How do we make progress? What are some good strategies and smart ways of doing it? So this is a graph that comes from the IPCC that Dr. Matsuno was involved with, that the climate scientists So I'm involved with the IPCC, but on the mitigation end, he and his colleagues are on the climate science side. And so they've come up with this idea that we can think about the climate change problem in terms of a carbon budget. So in other words, since the Industrial Revolution, basically since human society, human civilization was started using fossil energy, we've emitted about over 500 billion tons of carbon. And if, as the earlier discussion indicated, if we are going to stabilize the climate at 450 parts per million, even 500 or 550 parts per million, at some level before we get to catastrophic changes, if we are going to stabilize the climate, we have to limit the amount of carbon. And to stabilize the climate, we probably can emit only about maybe 500 billion tons more. Maybe less than that. There's a lot of debate about it because it depends on many factors, on how the ocean absorbs the carbon dioxide, how clouds function, the other greenhouse gases, what effect they have, and how many of those we emit. But I think this is a good way of summarizing it. So we have a carbon budget. We, the world, we humans, can emit another 300 to 500 billion tons, and at that point, we have to stop. No more. So if we emit another 500 billion, then we need to go to zero. That is very unrealistic. So if we continue emitting carbon at the rate we're emitting it today, we will end up filling that budget in the next 20 or 30 years. And then we need to go to zero. That's not possible. So we need to start reducing carbon now. And the problem is that, as I told you a moment ago, there are huge amounts of fossil energy in the ground that we can extract. And we can extract it at $100 a barrel or less. So the second conclusion here is that we will leave most of the fossil energy in the ground. We as humans. We are not going to take all of the fossil energy and use it. We cannot. We will destroy the earth if we do that. So the challenge to humans, to policymakers, to all of us, is how do we determine how much fossil energy stays in the ground and where? And so what are the policies, what are the strategies to do that? Because we are going to leave most of it. So that is the big challenge for us, to come up with policies and strategies to keep most of the fossil energy in the ground. So I'm going to focus on transportation. That's what I know most about, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So transportation is a big part of this challenge. Transportation accounts for about 1/4 of all the CO2 in the world and about half of all the oil. So here is an image to remember. If we follow the path we're on, this is what the future looks like. You're probably wondering, where is this place? Is it China? Is it Los Angeles? Well, those of you that are young and work with computer graphics will know that this is make-believe. But it's a good image. So what I'm going to talk about here today is I have 5 lessons, 5 conclusions that I want to share with you. And I'm going to, so this is just to give you a hint what I'm going to say. I'm going to say there is no single solution. There are many solutions we need to pursue. I'm also going to say we need to stop thinking about what will happen in 2100 or 2050. we know we need to start reducing carbon emissions now. So we need to start on that path. And that's what's important, is what we do now and the pathway that we follow. Another one is that there is not one set of solutions that everyone should follow. Every city, every country, every household is going to have different solutions and different paths forward. And another very important point, and this relates to the Blue Planet Prize and the Asahi Glass Foundation, is that scientists must play a very important role in this, because the choices, the strategies are very complicated, very difficult. And so if us scientists don't give good advice, then who will give good advice about what are the best choices? So we as scientists need to be involved at the local level with our cities, with our state and province governments, national governments, as well as internationally. And then there's a fifth conclusion, but I don't want to tell you that because you might leave, so I want you to stay here till the end. All right, so what I'm talking about is transforming transportation, because we cannot continue on the path we are on now. We need to make major changes. So it's the same as true with buildings and industry, but I'll focus on transportation. So when we look at transportation, we can think of it as having there being three legs to the transportation stool. And the one is us, individuals, our mobility and the land use and how we move around. Number two are the fuels that we use. And number three are the vehicles that we use. So the first leg, let me talk about the mobility part. So I come from California. California, in many ways, is the villain. California is where we invented cities built around cars, car-centric cities. We invented car-centric lifestyles. And the rest of the world is imitating what California did. But in California, we now understand, not just me, but the politicians and all the leaders understand we have gone too far. We have become too dependent on cars. Our cities are sprawled out. We use too much energy. We have too many vehicles. And so, in many ways, California is trying to atone for its sins. We are now pursuing strategies to reduce car dependence and to reduce our urban sprawl. And the problem, kind of the example or the extreme that's been created in California and the United States, is that only 3% of passenger travel, 3% of all of our travel is by public transportation. 3%. All the rest is by cars and by planes. So cars have won the war over public transportation. And so this illustrates what the challenge is. This is the population density of cities around the world. So cities in Asia are the most dense. So that's at the bottom. Highest density down here at the bottom. And the cities with the lowest density, the most spread out, the most sprawled, are in the United States and Australia. But everywhere, every city in the world is becoming less dense. Every city in the world is getting sprawled, is sprawling out. They're all headed in the same direction, and we need to stop that trend. So if we think about that in terms of the number of vehicles, in the United States, we have about 800 vehicles for every 1,000. In fact, we have more than one vehicle for every licensed driver. So for every person with a driver's license, there is more than one vehicle. It's crazy, all right? So, but that is the extreme. And we see but other countries are still very high. Japan is actually better than most of the rich countries, but even Japan has high car ownership. So but there is some good news here in terms of traveling, and that is in the rich countries of the world, the OECD countries, Europe, North America, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, the amount of driving per person has actually stopped going up. It had been going up forever. Ever since cars were invented, every year people got more cars and drove more. But that has stopped. That is not happening anymore. And in fact, in many of these countries, it looks like that the amount of driving per person is starting to go down in the rich countries. So that's a good sign. That's a good trend. But that's not the trend elsewhere in the less developed countries, in the less affluent countries. And so what we need is, in the rich countries, we need to reduce our car use more. And in the less developed countries, the developing countries, we need to somehow slow down the growth, because they are getting rich, and they do deserve and they do want more mobility. And but we need to figure out how to provide that mobility, that accessibility, with fewer cars and less driving and less energy use. And this is not saying that we should deprive people of something. In fact, we can create transportation systems that are even better than we have now, that don't depend so much on cars. There are many, and there are many reasons to do that. A simple one is that with more cars, it takes a huge investment in road infrastructure. And that's something that China and India are learning now, is that the more cars there are, it requires billions, even trillions of dollars in road infrastructure. And it also results in more pollution, more greenhouse gas emissions, more oil use, and it also creates equity problems. So I don't want to be seen as negative, and I want to point out that there are many trips, much vehicle use that can be reduced, and that would be positive. So here's an example. This is someone sitting in a car walking a dog. If that person would get out of the car and walk with the dog, they would spend much less money, use less energy, produce less pollution, and they would be healthier and live longer. So there are many trips that are taken that we can eliminate and not reduce our quality of life. Part of this idea going forward is that we need to create choice for people, more choice. Now, being in Tokyo, you might look at this and be skeptical, because Tokyo has very good public transportation. There are all forms of public transportation. It's very high quality, but that's very unusual in the world. And so even if you go to the outer edges of Tokyo or smaller cities, but especially if you go to more rural areas, if you go to other parts of the world, we need to create choice. So I'm from Northern California, near Silicon Valley. There has been an information technology revolution. It has transformed many industries. It has barely touched transportation. Transportation has barely changed in the last 60 or 80 years in terms of how it functions. The vehicles, our cars are much higher quality products. They're safer, more comfortable, but they drive at the same speed, they carry the same number of people. They still run on internal combustion engines using petroleum. Our bus system, our rail system are basically the same as they've been for many, many decades. So we can use the information technology revolution to create a whole new set of mobility services. We can create services where you just get on your smartphone, you push a button, and a vehicle will come and pick you up and take you where you want to go. Demand responsive transit. It's technically very easy to do, and it's really just a matter of organizing it and supporting it in different kinds of ways. And for that person that uses it, it'll be a little longer than for a car trip, but they can sit in the car and they can text messages to their friends. They can, I was going to say read newspapers, but no one reads newspapers anymore, except through the smartphone and their tablets. So there's many new types of services, what I call smart carpooling, the dynamic ride sharing. We can organize ourselves if we have information, if we know friends of ours are going to the same office to work, or going to the same ball game or the same concert. If we know they're going, we would be more likely, even enthusiastic, to ride together, to organize to go in the same vehicle and go to that event. But we need that information technology, those applications to be able to do it. And there are companies doing this in Europe and North America. I don't know in Japan, but I suspect in Japan also. But we need to support those companies, those small, they're mostly startup companies. So there's a whole set of other services. So there's many ways we can transform transportation. And we have the technology now, and it's not more expensive. It'll cost the same thing or even less. And so we need the leadership to be able to do this. So when we think about mobility, though, this is a very important message, is that we can't just say, let's wait for the politicians or let's wait for the CEOs to make the decisions and the choices for us. In the end, these are our choices. How we spend our money. Do we support these different kinds of mobility services and car sharing? Do we buy an electric car? Do we bicycle to work if it's easy to do and healthy? And it's not just as travelers and consumers, but it's also we vote for those politicians. And we are parts of those corporations and governments. So we as individuals have a responsibility, and we need to exercise that. All right, so the second leg is fuels. And the future of transportation fuels almost definitely will be some mix of biofuels, hydrogen, and electricity. And I have this great quote from the oil minister from Saudi Arabia. He said, "The Stone Age did not end for lack of stone, and the oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil." So even in Saudi Arabia, they understand that all of the fossil energy is not going to be taken out. We are going to leave most of the fossil energy in the ground. And so we need to figure out, how do we move forward? Which alternatives do we use? How do we produce them? And it is a big challenge because we're doing a very bad job so far. There's some ethanol, some biofuels being used in Brazil, some in the United States, but mostly we're still using oil for our vehicles. So as I said, the big challenge is, how do we keep most of the fossil energy underground, and how do we stimulate innovation, and how do we support the acceptance of new types of fuels? So there are many types of alternatives. There are many alternatives. We can convert fossil energy into many different fuels. We can make electricity from many different sources. We can make hydrogen from many sources. So this graph, I am not going to get into this graph, but it's just to tell you that there are many, many options for low carbon fuels. And there are some options for high carbon fuels, and those are the ones I've been talking to you about in the beginning, about those high carbon unconventional. We need to make sure we do not do that, but that we do focus on the low carbon ones. So I like to describe this process of moving to alternative fuels in terms of the fuel du jour phenomenon. And let me describe this. So about 30 years ago in the world, many countries, we looked to use synthetic fuels, what we now call unconventional oil. This was in the late 1970s and early 80s. And that was the idea. We were going to take coal and convert it into liquids and gases and oil shale, heavy oils. Well, that didn't happen. And then there was a lot of focus on methanol in the 1980s. And it got started, but it died very quickly. And then in the early 1990s, there was a lot of emphasis on electric vehicles. And that also died away. So what was going on here is what I call the fuel du jour phenomena. And what that means is that some new idea comes along. The politicians get very excited. The newspaper, the journalists, they get very excited. And they raise the expectations very high. They create hype. And what happens is the alternatives cannot meet those expectations, or at least not right away. And so the politicians lose interest, the media loses interest, and we go on to the next option. So we started with synfuels, methanol, electric vehicles, and then 10 years ago, hydrogen, and then ethanol about 5 or 6 years ago. And now we're all excited about electric vehicles again. And the question is, what's next? And I'll tell you what's next is, without government, without good policy, without good public policy, we will go right back up to the top of that list. We will start all over again with synfuels, with unconventional oil. And in fact, that's what the oil companies are investing in right now. 99% of their investment is for that heavy oil, offshore oil, Arctic oil. 1% is renewable energy. So if we let them go do what they would like to do, and they do it because it makes sense for them, not for society, but for them. So if we let them do that, we will go right back to the top here. The next fuel du jour will be unconventional oil. So one of the good things that's happened in California, and as you saw in the video before, there was a mention of it, the low carbon fuel standard that I was very involved in. Governor Schwarzenegger, Arnold Schwarzenegger, you know, the strong guy. He asked myself and another professor to develop the concept of a low-carbon fuel standard. And we did that, and it was eventually adopted by the California Air Resources Board. And actually, a similar version of that has been adopted by the European Union and a few other states, and also one of the provinces in Canada. And other governments are also considering it now. And I highlight this because it's an example of a policy that's very much science-based. And I say science-based because it requires life cycle analysis. It harnesses market forces. So this is not a case of government telling industry what to do. It's giving them a target and telling industry, we need you to reduce the carbon intensity of your fuel. We don't care how you do it, but you must do it. And if you don't want to do it or it's expensive, you can buy a credit from someone else that is willing to do it or that can do it at low cost. So this is an example of a good science-based policy. So then we get to the third leg, transforming vehicles. And in many ways, this is the biggest success story of all. Or at least it looks like it's going to be a big success story. And that is because cars are becoming much more energy efficient. They are switching to the use of electric motors. And this is happening in a way where the policies have been adopted for this reduction in energy use, this improvement in efficiency. And the industry itself has embraced these policies, has embraced these goals, and is actually investing huge amounts of money in developing more energy efficient and electric drive vehicles. So this is a big success story. These are the standards that have been adopted around the world for vehicles in terms of their fuel efficiency and greenhouse gases. And what you see here is every major country in the world, including China, it has policies and performance standards in place to require the industry to reduce their energy consumption. So this is happening everywhere in the world. Even in the United States, I would point out. And as part of that, in the near term, what they're doing is they're using conventional technology. They're using lightweight materials, aluminum, magnesium, to make the vehicles lighter and more energy efficient. They're making the engines, the combustion processes in the engines more efficient, better transmissions. But they're gradually shifting to using electric motors. And this is what the future of vehicles is. It's using electric motors. And there will be a mix of different types of vehicles with electric motors. They can be pure battery electric vehicles where all the electricity comes from the battery. It can be plug-in hybrids where they have a small combustion engine that might use gasoline, but it could use natural gas or it could use biofuels. And another version of electric vehicles would be a fuel cell vehicle, where it's electric motor, but the electricity comes from hydrogen. And so the hydrogen is converted on the vehicle by a fuel cell into electricity. So you put the hydrogen in the vehicle, and then the fuel cell converts it to electricity, and now you have an electric vehicle. And this is more difficult, but we are moving in that direction. The only question is really how fast. And I would note that Japan is a global leader on vehicle electrification, has the highest sales of hybrid vehicles in the world. It's about 19 or 20% of all the vehicles sold in Japan now are hybrid vehicles. And the hybrid means that they have a small electric motor. All of their energy comes from the gasoline, but they also have an electric motor. And so over time, the electric motors and the batteries will get bigger, and the gasoline engine will get smaller. So Japan is taking a lead in this. It's also taking a lead with electric vehicles and putting very fast chargers. There's almost 2,000 chargers, fast chargers in Japan, more than any other country in the world, where you can go and charge your vehicle in 20 or 25 minutes. Now, all of my talk so far has been about cars, but I do want to emphasize that, and that is what I'm talking about, but we need to do the same thing with trucks. And the improvements with trucks is not happening so fast, not as fast as cars, but it is happening also. Trucks are becoming more energy efficient. The policies have been slower to be adopted. Actually, Japan was the first country to adopt fuel efficiency standards for trucks, and now other countries are doing the same thing. But we can also move to electric trucks that are using fuel cells, that get electricity from overhead, like you see in one of the pictures, or even use batteries. And just to give you a sense of the future, so in California, where we have policies requiring the transition to very low emission vehicles, this is our plan for the future. And the rules are already adopted through 2025, but we are planning that by 2040, almost all of the vehicles sold in California will be battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, or fuel cell electric vehicles. There will be after 2040, there will be very few gasoline or diesel cars being sold. Now, all of this is quite difficult. I'm not trying to say this future is simple or easy, because in the real world, we have many different interest groups. We have the consumers that I've talked to you about. There's the automobile industries that have their interest, although, as I said, so far the auto industry seems to be showing the most leadership out of all of these in moving forward. The oil industry has been much slower, is not showing leadership. And we have government, of course, that plays a key role in all of this as well. So there's this complicated mix, and maybe I should put a scientist right in the middle of this, advising and helping everyone. So let me provide you a list of what I think are the most important policy strategies to transform transportation. The number one policy strategy, or a first policy strategy, is to create performance standards for fuels and vehicles. Performance standards that require a reduction in energy consumption and greenhouse gases. And in fact, as I said, almost all countries are doing this already with vehicles. They will continue to have to tighten up those standards going forward, but they have done a good job. Most countries have done a good job so far. And then we need to do the same thing with fuels. So the low carbon fuel standard does something very similar on the fuel side, but we need that low carbon fuel standard or something like it to be adopted everywhere, including in Japan. So I volunteer to anyone that wants help or assistance in developing a low carbon fuel standard for Japan. I volunteer my assistance. Meet me, I have my business card after the meeting. That is serious. A second one is, we can't expect to just adopt regulations and tell the consumers what to do or tell the car companies what to do. We need to also create incentives. So we need policies that align the regulations with the market instruments. So we have to adjust the prices, or we have to create incentives to help out the car companies and to help the oil companies and help the consumers so that they can make the right decisions. We need, the third item here is, we need to accelerate the commercialization of advanced vehicles. Because even car companies that are investing in fuel cells and electric vehicles, even with the very strong policies, their preference would be to just continue making the gasoline engines a little more efficient and using more lightweight materials. And that's good, but if we don't get started now with the advanced technologies, it will just delay the entire process. So we need to make sure that the industry is making investments now in developing these advanced technologies. And we need policies to support that. So we have, in the United States, we have the zero emission vehicle mandate that does that. We need to restrain vehicle use. And that means improving public transportation, creating those new types of mobility services that I talked about, increasing the cost of driving to reflect the true cost of driving. And we need to manage land use better so that it doesn't keep spreading out. And we need more investment in research and development. And not just in terms of the technology, but in terms of people. We need to be training the next generation of leaders and scientists and experts in all of these areas I've been talking about. And so, in conclusion, these are back to what I said earlier, there is no single solution. There's many different solutions. We need to be pursuing many of them. For instance, I've written many books and hundreds of papers on alternative fuels, and I still don't know what the precise best solution will be in 20 or 30 years. I know the basic choices that need to be made, the direction we need to go in, but it's going to be a different solution everywhere. We need to focus on change. So that's what I was just saying. We know what direction we need to go in. We need to reduce carbon. We need to be innovative in ways that improve energy efficiency and reduce carbon. And there's many, many ways of doing that. Many companies are doing many innovative things. And I've met actually quite a few companies here just in my last few days that are pursuing many of these innovations, but they need support and encouragement to do that. There is not one solution or a set of solutions even. Every city, every region, every country is going to have a different mix of solutions. And as I said earlier, the scientific community really needs to be engaged. And this is a responsibility not just to the scientists to engage, but to the policymakers to work with and make the effort to reach out to the experts and the scientists. These are two different cultures, and they think very differently, they behave differently, but we need to all work together to make sure that we do bring science to the policy process. And last, we need to take action now. We cannot wait. So I like this picture because these are firefighters, and they're getting their picture taken, and they're smiling. And behind them, the house is burning down. Well, our house is also burning down, and we better pay attention and take action now. Domo arigato gozaimasu.